Well, thank you very much. A number of years ago now, Greg and I happened to do a book on the history of basketball at UC. And as you know, Greg is a terrific sports fan to the point where I had to explain to him how much a three-point shot was worth. So, but anyway, this talk actually grew out of the quadricentennial of Shakespeare's death in 2016. We have, we'll get into the Shakespeare collection at UC and all that, but we started looking more into Shakespeare, and I became fascinated by all the characters who came through Cincinnati in the early decades of the city's history, and what they sort of brought to all of this. So that's why I've entitled this, and that's not my Shakespeare picture there. That's actually from a production done by the Marymount Players a couple of years ago on Shakespeare, and it was such a great shot of him with the clown nose that I had to use it for this, because this is not a serious Shakespeare study here. In fact, it's anything but. Go ahead, Greg. Anyway, Shakespeare was being produced in this country as early as the colonial period, but it was sort of divided then. You had the northeastern part that banned performances and just thought Shakespeare should be read as a poet or recited in some way. And then you had the frontier, which included Ohio at that time, as well as the South, who believed that Shakespeare should be performed. So there was a big difference between the areas of the country. Washington loved Shakespeare a great deal. So did Jefferson and John Adams. And as a matter of fact, they made an early pilgrimage to Stratford-on-Avon and came away severely disappointed, as so many were at that time. But we had this issue in this country where the Puritans, who didn't like theater at all, still liked Shakespeare, to the point where in many of the homes, as America grew, you had three books. You had the Bible, you had Pilgrim's Progress, and you had the works of Shakespeare. So anyway, this first, in Cincinnati, for instance, we started having performances as early as 1801, right when it was still Fort Washington and the city of Cincinnati, and those plays were put on by soldiers. By 1811, we had a traveling amateur group that was coming through here. By the 1820s, we had the first theater built in Cincinnati so that Shakespeare productions could be done. We had the famous Chapman family. How many of you remember 10 Nights in a Barroom? If you remember it, then you didn't spend 10 nights in a barroom. But anyway, the Chapman family put on these riverboat shows, and they often put on Shakespeare as well. And then Alexander Drake and his family came down the river and produced Shakespeare. But anyway, Shakespeare was also not only being performed, but it became part of the elocution lessons in schools, not only in Cincinnati, but throughout the rest of the country. And this fellow here, John Satchos, actually produced books with a lot of Shakespeare in it to teach elocution. William Holmes McGuffey, the McGuffey readers, would pick that up later on. Go ahead, Greg. Now, this is Ellen Keene. Ellen Keene was married to Charles Keene, who was the son of Edmund Keene, who was England's foremost actor until he drank and whored himself to death. But they made a tour to Cincinnati in the 1850s, and the reason these actors came mainly from England to tour the South, Louisville, Charleston, St. Louis, these were all on the circuit of traveling around into Cincinnati. But the reason they came were two: lots of money and people who applauded. Now, the thing is, you had a woman by the name of Frances Trollope who tried to start a business here and later wrote a book excoriating the people of Cincinnati. She hated going to the theater and seeing a Shakespeare production where everybody down in front of her was either spitting or kicking mud off their boots. And then she had the audacity to write a book about this, Domestic Manners of the Americans. Charles Dickens picked up that whole thing, too, of disparaging Americans. Well, what that led to was a little bit of conflict between the English and the Americans in terms of who had the better Shakespeare and who was nicer about it. Ellen Keene and her husband Charles were not nice about it. They came here and earned a ton of money, but all it was filled with complaints in their letters that everything was so expensive, that the champagne was not up to snuff, in Cincinnati. I don't know, Molly, if it is now or not. You'd have to let us know. Their big complaint was you cannot even leave your clothes outside of your room and be expected to get them back in the morning. They would be stolen. Well, God's trousers. Everybody's going to have their clothes stolen, leaving them out in Cincinnati. So anyway, that was Ellen Keene. Next one, Greg. This is one of my favorite guys. Gustavus Brooke, an Irishman who also liked to tipple a bit, and that's his wife, Avonia Jones. Well, Gustavus Brooke came to Cincinnati a few times, so did Avonia, but they didn't act together. They were here at different times, but wound up getting married in Australia because Gustavus loved Australia. The thing is, he loved it so much that he didn't want to leave, so in order to keep the crowds coming, he would bill each tour as his final farewell tour. People finally caught on, and they made fun of him, but they still came out. Well, he was back in England after his tour in Cincinnati and the United States, and was planning to go to Australia again, and he set sail on the SS London. 10 days out from the coast of England, the boat sank, and Gustavus was there at the very end helping people into lifeboats and then realizing he wasn't going to be saved. So he corked up 2 wine bottles and threw them adrift. 6 months later on the English coast they arrived. One was to his manager that said, "Please take care of dear Avonia." And the other one said, "Avonia, there's no hope, the boat is sinking." And unfortunately, Avonia died a year later from consumption. So, next one, Greg. And here we have probably the most famous acting family in 19th century America. Junius Booth Sr., and then his 3 sons, Junius Jr., Edwin, and John Wilkes. Now, you all know who John Wilkes is, right? Yeah. Terrific actor. Just a wonderful, wonderful actor. The shot you see there of the 3 of them, 3 brothers, was an occasion in New York City when they all acted in Julius Caesar. Now, the plays that were acted in for Shakespeare in this country, particularly in Cincinnati, were the major tragedies you would think. Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, and what's the one I'm missing here? King Lear. They were the ones that everybody wanted to see. The comedies weren't so hot. They didn't care about those. But the thing is, everybody knew these plays. They at least knew lines from them. They could recite them. When actors screwed them up, they would holler out there. We had our own groundlings then who would throw things at the actors and cast things on the stage and criticize them and write nasty newspaper articles about them. Well, Junius Sr. died on the riverboat from Lexington to Cincinnati when he was about to give a performance here. The brothers carried on with their careers. Go ahead, Greg. And this is Edwin and John Wilkes. Edwin happened to be performing in Cincinnati when his brother John Wilkes killed Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The word got to Cincinnati very quickly. So in fear for his life, he closed his production here and snuck out of town in the middle of the night. Go ahead, Greg. And this is William Macready. Some say he was the greatest actor of his age in England, but he's what started a big conflict in the United States between the English and American actors. Here he is in the case of Othello. And of course, if you saw the productions we had in Cincinnati this past year, Red Velvet, about Ira Aldridge, first African American to play Othello, and the racism he faced here. Before that, it was white actors who would cork up their faces. But anyway, William Macready was this very traditional English actor. Go ahead, Greg. And his rival in the United States was Edwin Forrest, who was this burly guy who projected emotion and strength, and William Macready projected elegance. And so they were great friends at the beginning, but because the conflict between their fans of who was the better got to them too, and they started hating each other to the point where when one would be in Cincinnati performing Macbeth, by God, the other one would get here, rent another theater, and perform Macbeth as well. It got to the point, and I'll get back to 1848 when they had a big conflict here, but it got to the point where in 1849 in New York City that their fans rioted to the point where dozens of people were killed by the police, the Astor Place riots. Anyway, back in 1848, they were competing against each other here in Cincinnati. Edwin had the worst of it, though. One day after a performance, he went back to his hotel, opened the door, and there was Kate, his wife, on her knees in front of another actor, George Jameson. She said he was checking her skull for bumps for phrenology studies. Phrenology was popular at the time, so who knows, could be. So it was a matter of head one way or the other. So anyway, Edwin and Kate wound up getting a divorce, and everything went down from there. Go ahead, Greg. There were so many amateur productions going on here, too, besides all the professionals coming through, and one of the biggest ones was this benefit, and I don't know if you can see the date or anything at all, but it was a benefit put on by Enoch Carson. And we'll get to Enoch Carson later because he's a central figure in Shakespeare collections here in Cincinnati. But Enoch Carson put on this benefit of Hamlet for the widows and orphans in the Civil War, and the lieutenant governor of Ohio played Hamlet, and Enoch Carson had a little role as well in that. This is a silk bookmark that we happen to find in what we call an extra illustrated edition of Carson's Shakespeare collection. Go ahead, Greg. The two main theaters at this time was the Woods Theater and the Grand Opera House. The Woods Theater was for the lower class people who wanted a lot of rambunctious Shakespeare, and the Grand Opera House tried to get the more refined playgoer. There became this difference, too, even among Americans, as to how Shakespeare was going to be treated. Go ahead, Greg. And here we have an interesting woman, Charlotte Cushing, great Shakespearean actress of our time in the 19th century, was unabashed about her gender preferences, but she acted with her sister a lot. In the lithograph you see next to that, Charlotte Cushing is playing Romeo, and her sister is playing Juliet. We'll have another actress whose mother and father took turns playing Romeo to her Juliet. So this is when we had a big surge in psychology in Cincinnati. Go ahead, Greg. This is actually a playbill I recently purchased of Julius Caesar, and again it shows how often Shakespeare was being performed here. In the 19th century, you were having Shakespeare nearly every week in Cincinnati, and it was always somebody playing or going through, or amateur ones. Greg, what's the next one there? Fanny Davenport? Yeah. A lot of you have heard of Fanny Davenport. A lot of people remarked locally on her weight and her bitchiness to other actors, and mostly that was all true. But the next set of actresses there, Viola Allen and Ada Rehan. Ada Rehan was an Irish woman who managed to have quite a career here, as well as Viola Allen. But these are two women who made the transition from the stage to silent films. And that would be important, too, in what happens to Shakespeare in this country. Throughout the 19th century, it was sort of a populist appreciation of Shakespeare. But by the time we get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then into the silent film era, we start getting this highfalutin academic notion of Shakespeare, and the common people fall away from it. Next one, Greg. This is Sir Henry Irving, who played Hamlet here. Sir Henry Irving came here with his manager, Bram Stoker. Anybody recognize that name? Yeah. Yeah, so Bram Stoker came and arranged everything for Sir Henry, and he played Hamlet here several times. Next one, Greg. These are two of my favorites. This is Adelaide Ristori and Tommaso Salvini, two Italians who toured America, England, Australia, even Africa to some extent, performing Hamlet. Salvini performed Hamlet. Ristori didn't ever perform a complete part. She would perform the sleepwalking scene of Lady Macbeth in the Macbeth play, and that's the scene where you hear the famous damn spot. But she always performed it to to audiences who raved about it. Now, Salvini was an interesting guy. He refused to speak anything other than Italian, even though the rest of the play was in English. The actors were okay with that. Salvini figured he was so good it didn't matter that he was speaking Italian, that people would love him anyway. And they did. As a matter of fact, he once remarked that he could bring an audience to tears simply by reading a menu. And of course, the mustache is wonderful too. So in England, a lot of these actors would run into criticism from the newspapers, etc., for being either not English or American. Charles Fector was a Frenchman who was criticized all the time because of his French accent. Something, still happens, I guess. The next one is a wonderful Polish actress, Helena Modjeska. Helena Modjeska performed in Cincinnati many times, and as a matter of fact, she had a stroke here and was bedridden for some time, but as soon as she recovered, she continued her performances. She was more well known for the estate she had out in California, where she welcomed other actors to come and visit her. Next one, Greg. This one is the 1883 Dramatic Festival in Cincinnati that was held at Music Hall, where they performed a different Shakespeare play every night, and they brought in all the top actors and actresses in the country to act in Hamlet, Othello, Lear, Macbeth, and all the others. And this was a little cutout that would pop up as a souvenir. The next one shows two of the actors, John McCulloch and Lawrence Barrett, who were part of that 1883 troupe that performed at Music Hall. McCulloch was another Irishman. We had a tremendous number of Irish actors who went through Cincinnati. McCulloch was a sad case, though. He would always have nervous breakdowns and be confined to an asylum for a while and then come out and act again. Lawrence Barrett was his friend and encouraged him and took care of him, but finally McCulloch went insane for the final time and died. The next slide is James Edwin Murdoch. Murdoch, if you can believe it, looking at him here, played Hamlet. So we've got a college boy in the guise of a 65-year-old man. Murdoch actually started an elocution school, spoke a lot about Shakespeare in the schools, promoted Shakespeare in the schools, and he's one of the few national Shakespeareans that we can actually lay claim to by virtue of the fact that he's in Spring Grove Cemetery right now. As part of the 1883 Dramatic Festival in Cincinnati, Elsinore. Everybody recognizes that, right? Elsinore was built in response to that. It wasn't used as a set or anything like that, but the people were so enthralled with this dramatic festival that when the city had to build a structure for the water treatment plant, they hired Samuel Hannaford's firm to create Elsinore. And of course, it still stands there and it's used for storage now. In 1884, they had another dramatic festival here because the 83 one was so popular. And this time, Thomas Kean came. And Kean was famous for his portrayal of all the major Shakespeare figures of Hamlet and Macbeth and Lear. The 1884 festival brought a number of new actors and actresses to Cincinnati, but it also led to something else, sort of a revival of interest in, I guess, the everyday use of Shakespeare. And part of this was this next one here, where a stenographic publishing company in Cincinnati decided to publish Shakespeare plays in shorthand. It was a lesson. Ben Pittman, the famous woodcarver, actually came here to Cincinnati to teach stenography and set up the Phonographic Institute. Decades later, the publishing arm of that was still in business, and so they took a famous edition of Shakespeare, Tales from Shakespeare, and decided to put it all to shorthand. Having done jury duty today and watching the court reporter, they can have that business, And two of the loveliest actresses we had here who competed with each other in their loveliness was Clara Morris and Mary Anderson. Clara Morris actually segued into a very lucrative silent film career, but along the way she alienated just about everyone she knew because in all her writings she was the premier actor on the stage and everybody else were her supporting players. Going back a little bit now to Enoch Carson, he was a Cincinnati businessman who absolutely loved Shakespeare. He collected all the books that he could afford at the time, which did not include a first folio or a third folio or a fourth folio, but virtually every edition of Shakespeare that was published in the 18th century up through his own time. He was also a notable Mason in Cincinnati, and when he died, he had 50,000 books on the Masonic rite and sold those off at auction. As a matter of fact, downtown now in the Masonic Temple, there is a painting of Enoch Carson, and in the background is a figure, Hamlet, holding Yorick's skull. But when he died, William A. Proctor, who was the son of one of the founders of Procter & Gamble, William A. was a trustee member of the University of Cincinnati, and he bought Carson's Shakespeare collection along with 3 other collections from private individuals, and those became the founding collections of the University of Cincinnati. The Carson collection, as a matter of fact, before Proctor donated it, he took this famous edition, the Charles Knight edition of Shakespeare, and disbound it all and took all of Carson's ephemera, the little souvenirs and lithographs and drawings and things that he had collected over the decades about Shakespeare and Shakespearean actors, and had them bound in. So it's what we call an extra illustrated edition, and that means it's a unique edition too. There's no other one like it because it was specially made by William A. Proctor. And one of the ephemeral pieces is this souvenir program from the 1883 festival. There were 2 actors, Stuart Robson and W.H. What was his last name? Greg, read it off there, or I'll read my notes here. Crane, W.H. Crane, Billy Crane. Thing about Robson and Crane, their whole professional careers, they had only acted with each other. They had always been on the stage with each other. Well, when they were performing at Music Hall, this is another play they did at the Grand Opera House. When they were performing at Music Hall, Crane was in the audience, Robson was in the play, and Crane was going nuts. So he snuck backstage, grabbed one of the players, one of the bit players, took his costume from him, put it on, and walked out on stage so that it could never be said that he and Robson didn't always act together. And then you had people like Robert Mantrell. Robert Mantrell married 5 times, each time to a woman who was significantly younger than him, but what he wanted was a supporting actress. He would bring a repertoire to the various cities he played in, including Cincinnati, and would do half a dozen different plays over the course of a week or so. And then his wife, in this case, Genevieve Hamper, who was quite a good actress on her own, would play the supporting roles. He would never allow them to have top billing either. The second photo there is actually of him as King Lear, and as I've remarked before, looks more like a crazed Santa Claus than Lear. And that's the program he had in the early 1900s when he appeared in Cincinnati. Now this next one, these next few ones. There was this actress, Julia Marlowe. Yeah, I'm married to a very wonderful woman who in my opinion is very beautiful, but to me, the most beautiful woman who ever lived was Julia Marlowe. Julia Marlowe was born in England, raised in Portsmouth, Ohio, and as a young child, they moved here to Cincinnati. So she got her acting career started here. She went on to become, first she acted in comedies, light comedies, and throwaways and farces and things like that, but then she started acting in Shakespeare plays, and she hooked up with a man who eventually became her husband, Edward H. Southern, and together they performed Romeo and Juliet in particular, Hamlet, Midsummer Night's Dream, a number of other plays like that. And as you can see from these images, it was really this dramatic aspect. You can even buy an old 78 of the dialogue they had from Romeo and Juliet. You can hear it on YouTube too, but it's this very... The one thing I liked about Red Velvet, well, I liked a lot of things about it, but one of the things I liked about Red Velvet when it was performed here, the woman who played Ellen Keene gave a perfect rendition of the over-the-top acting style of the 1800s, and Julia Marlowe and Edward Southern sort of carried this through. Go to the next one. And these are just more images of Julia. And the next one. And the next one. Oh, I've got an album full of these. And the next one, actually, is a little bit different. I don't know if you can read that poem that Moreline used in promoting their beer, but they figured Bill Shakespeare would be a good one to do that. Now, that's Iago. Right. Yeah, I didn't know if you could read it, though. Yeah, so they took a villain and used it to sell Moreline beer. This next one, though, this is Theda Bara. Theodosia Goodman, who was raised just about a mile from here, and attended Walnut Hills High School, attended UC for a couple of years, and then moved to New York to act on stage and became one of the pioneers of the silent film industry and became the first vamp of sorts in the movie A Fool There Was. But in 2017, we recognized the centennial of her appearance in a silent film in 1917 of Cleopatra. And she was a very interesting woman. The whole thing about her life was a publicity scheme. In fact, she was this very quiet woman who would go home every night and cook her husband dinner. She kept a house in Cincinnati near Xavier, and I think they've recently torn it down. They owned it for decades. But she was the original silent film vamp, acted in Cleopatra, and then also acted in Romeo and Juliet, which is the next one, Greg. Now, again, here you have a 35-year-old woman playing a 14-year-old virgin. But, you know, a lot of makeup, you know, what are you going to do? And then this would have been in the early teens, but around the same time then, UC started celebrating Shakespeare with the 1916 tricentennial of his death. They put on a week-long pageant of Elizabethan markets, of parades, of plays, et cetera, the whole thing. They put out a cookbook of what they thought were Elizabethan meals, and actually the the Cincinnati Times-Star, filmed it for distribution in the theaters as a newsreel of all this celebration going on. Next one, Greg, shows the program and the little ticket thing you wore. You know, English departments never get along well, but this English department decided to come together in, I don't know, some sort of dance. I'm not sure what they called it. But during all this time, too, we had Shakespeare showing up in sculpture. The one on the left is the original Cincinnati Public Library building downtown that showed, first and foremost, Shakespeare above the door, and then he's bracketed by John Milton and Benjamin Franklin. There were stories for years that sculpture of Shakespeare survived with the destruction of the building and was housed in a hidden garden in the public library. It'd be great to find it. The one on the right is actually the relief of Shakespeare on the building where I work, Blagan Library at UC. Blagan Library the architectural details are devoted to the heritage of learning, the history of the book, and everything about that aspect is conveyed in that building. And one of the things is a relief on one side of prominent leaders from Western civilization. On the other side of the building are leaders from Eastern civilization. But on the Western side is Shakespeare there. We also had a relief of Shakespeare on Wilson Auditorium at UC before that was torn down. But in their wisdom, the architects saved the reliefs, and they're now in storage out in Bond Hill. But there is a huge one of Shakespeare. It stands about 10 feet tall. And then finally, or close to final, CCM celebrated Shakespeare, still does in a big way. I was telling Neve not too long ago, I took my wife to see Hamlet at CCM. She doesn't like Shakespeare at all, but, you know, we've got this marriage thing going. So it's 3.5 hours, and, you know, an hour in, she turns to me and whispers, "How much longer is this?" And I said, "Well, you know, hold on to your seat. We're going to go for a while." But it was during that play, for some reason, Hamlet was running around barefoot on stage. At the same time, there were soldiers dressed in World War I uniforms with rifles and then Elizabethan swords. So it was kind of a mishmash of everything. But the greatest part of that 3.5 hour ordeal was when Hamlet stabbed Polonius, you know, through the curtain when he's in Gertrude's bedroom. Polonius falls down dead, and there's the appropriate stage blood and all that. Well, we're watching this as Hamlet goes on against Gertrude, and Polonius needs to stretch. He needs to turn over, and so it kind of ruined the whole effect, but then in a way it made it worthwhile. And this is, of course, Cincinnati Shakespeare Theater, their dedicated theater space down in Over the Rhine now. The reason I think that Shakespeare went from a populist aspect of our culture to a more refined academic aspect is the beginning of film, because you had a lot of these Shakespearean actors and actresses who transferred their skills into silent film, where you didn't have words and you had to have all these histrionic movements, which they had cultivated on the stage in the 19th century anyway. So it was a natural progression to that. And then with people seeing film and other things like that, other than Shakespeare in the schools, it died out for some time. There were occasional productions of Shakespeare in Cincinnati in the 20th century. Katharine Hepburn appeared in a production here. Maurice Evans appeared here in a production of Hamlet. And I don't know if any of you remember Maurice Evans, but how many of you remember the TV show Bewitched? Maurice Evans played her father in that. Sort of a come down from Hamlet, but still, it's a paycheck. And then we're seeing this turnabout now with the Cincinnati Shakespeare Theater, because they go out to the schools. They run camps and workshops. If you ever have a chance to take their class on stage fighting or anything like that, it's well worthwhile. But go ahead, Greg. I think one of the greatest things, you know, there are over 250 Shakespeare festivals in the United States every year. And most of them take place in the summer, and most of them are free when they take place in the summer. Well, one of the best things we've had with Shakespeare in this city is Cincinnati Shakespeare in the Park that we have. This year they're doing Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, and I think A Midsummer Night's Dream. But last year they did Merry Wives of Windsor. That was hilarious. It was really, really good. But they're bringing this out to everyday people again, so we're getting this emphasis of local culture that we haven't had for the past 100 years. And I think that will about do it.